So I can create a chain here. I can sequence what language I learn in what order as to maximize positive transfer between the languages. Hello everyone, my name is William, aka the Swedish Polyglot, and in this video I will be discussing why I think that Scandinavians are so good at English. Scandinavians, according to an article I read at least, have the highest level of English as a second language. And why is that, you might ask? And I will be covering basically two primary reasons why I believe that is the case. And the first reason, I believe, is that Scandinavians or Scandinavian societies, Norway, Denmark and Sweden primarily, have systems in place in their societies that make it inevitable for people who grew up there to acquire English. And what do I mean by systems? So in my last video I talked about systems versus goals. And systems are basically things that have no specific endpoint. It's just a process, right? It's more like a process, right? And goals are something that you define and it has an endpoint, right? Where you want to achieve something. Now obviously Swedish people, Danish people, Norwegian people, we don't set goals, right? I want to achieve this level of English at this age, right? It just happens, mostly in my experience, or I believe that's the case. So I'll give you a few examples. So for example, in Sweden, most of our media, movies, games, our internet, most media basically is in English. Not all of it, but most of it, in my opinion and my experience. It might differ depending on the person. Anyway, so you could view that as a system, right? Society, that's just a process that we engage in society, in Swedish society, for example, without even thinking about it, right? We don't have to set goals because the process is already there. And you can contrast this to other countries in Europe, for example, Spain, France, Italy, for example, where the level of English is, I would argue, lower. There are many people who are, of course, reach a high level of English in these countries as well. But the difference, I believe, lie mostly in the fact that the systems in these societies, there aren't systems in place in these societies that make it inevitable for these people, French people, Italian people, Spanish people, to learn English to an advanced level. Because, for example, I believe their media is mostly in their native language, right? Whether it is Spanish, French, or Italian. I haven't grown up in these countries. This is just my view from talking to people from these countries. And their movies are dubbed mostly, I believe, on TV, for example. And so there's a disparity in systems. And I believe this disparity in systems is what causes some countries to develop a higher level of English as a second language compared to others, right? And I believe it's also due to the fact that Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, they're small languages. Spanish, French, Italian, those are big languages. And there are incentives to dub movies, for example, or to keep the media in their native language, right? And so that's the first reason, right? And the second reason, I believe, is that I believe that Scandinavian languages, Swedish, Norwegian, and Danish, have a high degree of positive transfer to English. And what does positive transfer mean? It's a term in psychology used to define when previous learning experiences have a positive impact on later learning experiences. For example, Swedish is a Germanic language. Now it's a Northern Germanic language, while English is a Western Germanic language. But nonetheless, they're Germanic languages, they have similar roots. And so there are lots of similarities in terms of vocabulary, and they also share lots of like loan words from French, from Arabic, from Greek, from Latin. So there are many roots that are shared. And so there are many cognates, which are words that are similar in origin. So that's one reason, right? Having Swedish as your native language, because there are so many similarities in terms of syntax, grammar, vocabulary, word order, the way you express ideas, for example, that makes it easier to acquire English as compared to if your native language is, let's say, I don't know, Japanese or Chinese or something, where there are the differences are greater, right? So even if you had the same amount of input, I believe they would reach a lower level because the amount of positive transfer isn't as high as for Swedish people, for example. So it's not like an even playing field, you could say. And I would also say that there are also a lack of negative transfer from Scandinavian languages to English. And what's negative transfer? So it's the opposite of positive transfer. It means that previous learning experiences have negative impacts on future learning experiences. So for example, I'm learning Japanese at the moment, and the way English and Japanese are structured, or Swedish and Japanese are structured, is very different. The word order is very different, the way you express ideas is very different, and there's no way for me to guess from English to Japanese how to express ideas, while as a Swedish person, it's easier to guess to English, sort of, because ideas are expressed in very similar ways in Swedish and English, while from, for example, Swedish to Japanese, it's very different. So I don't have the benefit of just being able to guess my way through how to express ideas, right? So it's a lack of negative transfer as well, not just positive. So we have systems in place in Swedish society and Scandinavian societies in general that make it inevitable for people to acquire English, because there's lots of input in the environment, for example. And the positive transfer from Swedish to English also makes that input more comprehensible. It will be easier to understand English if your native language is Swedish than if it is Japanese, for example, because there are similarities that we can notice as we engage in input in the language. And the third point is that there's a relative lack of negative transfer from Scandinavian languages to English. So there's no great interference between these two languages. They sort of support each other, you could say. That was a summary, and now I will be talking about how we can apply these ideas in our own language learning, for example, or how societies at large could apply these ideas. So starting with the first idea, right? So Scandinavian societies have systems in place that make it inevitable for people who live in those countries to acquire English, right? And in a similar way, we could construct similar systems in our own daily life, even if we don't live in a country where your target language is spoken natively, right? So what sort of systems am I talking about, right? We want to have systems for input, right? We want to maybe convert our digital language to our target language. Maybe, on Facebook, on our social media, on YouTube, when we watch movies and series, we can, grab a VPN and watch Netflix in our target country, so we can just watch Netflix in our target language. That's a system for input, and we don't need a goal to accomplish that. We can just create that process, and that will sort of, if we keep doing it long enough, it will inevitably lead to us acquiring our target language, right? Well, it depends. If the scripture also takes a long time to acquire, for example, Japanese kanji or ansi, you might want to spend time on that. But if you have the same scripture language and the language is similar at least, then that sort of processes could by themselves lead you to acquiring a good level in your target language, right? One could also argue that you want to have systems that forces you to communicate in the language in some way. I don't believe that output is as important as input, but you could have those sort of systems as well. Those systems aren't in place in Scandinavian societies as much. So while Scandinavian people tend to reach an advanced level of comprehension, mostly, like across the board, more or less, at least in the current generation, there's a greater variety in terms of how good people are at outputting the language, because that's where there's a greater variety, right? Some people get more opportunities to produce the language, while other people get fewer opportunities, right? But how much input people get is fairly stable, I believe. But of course, there's going to be people who get more input than others as well. So that's an example of how we can apply that in our own language learning. And we could have systems for integrating our target language with our daily activities. For example, I'm studying psychology at the university, and I've started to integrate Spanish, Portuguese, German, and French with studying psychology. So the more I study psychology, the more I spend time in these languages. So that's a system that makes it inevitable for me to progress in these languages. Okay, point number 2. If we want to learn multiple languages, we want to maximize the positive transfer from one language to the next. So for example, if I want to learn many languages, right, I should probably focus on one or two language groups. I could focus on Germanic languages like German, Dutch, Swedish, and so on. And I could focus on Romance languages like Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Italian, for example, because the more languages I learn to understand within each group, the easier it will be to learn languages in the same group, because I will have more cognates available to me. Cognates are words that are similar in two languages, right? They have similar roots. And so I can maximize the positive transfer from language to language. And also, even if there aren't too many similarities in terms of vocabulary, there can be other similarities that you can leverage. For example, if I want to learn Japanese, Mandarin, and Cantonese, and Vietnamese, for example, let's say I could start with Japanese, right? Because you have kanji, Chinese characters, and other complexities in the language. If I learn Japanese, it'll be fairly quick for me to learn how to read in Chinese, right? Because I already know Chinese characters. Now there are a few differences, but I've learned how to acquire those characters before, so I can do it again faster this time. Also, having learned Japanese, that would help me learning Korean, because the grammar, the word order, and so on is very similar in these languages. So you can, and then if I learn Mandarin, not the only, but the major complexity there, I guess, will be the tones. So if I learn how to learn tones, then learning Cantonese later, the only difference would be, not the only difference, other complexities, but one complexity would be I just need to add a few more tones. But because I've learned to manage these complexities before, I can do it again in a more efficient manner in the future. So there are other ways of finding positive transfer, right? And even, let's say I want to learn Vietnamese later. Cantonese and Vietnamese have the same tones, I believe. So, and that's the major complexity of Vietnamese as far as I know. So I can create a chain here. I can sequence what language I learn in what order as to maximize positive transfer between the languages. And we will also want to look at what aspects of our native language or previously acquired languages, how they could have a negative transfer, a negative impact on our target language, learning our target language. And one example of this is how ideas are expressed, for example. Now, as I talked about earlier, learning English after having learned Swedish, for example, as my native language, the negative transfer isn't that great because the way you express ideas is very similar. While if I'm learning Japanese, I won't be able to guess myself to the right answers, how to express ideas, because it's different. The word order is different. You just express it in arbitrarily different ways, right? So you want to look at that and you want to find strategies for minimizing that negative transfer. And in the case of Japanese, it's just a matter of focusing on input, because you need to get the language inside of yourself first, because then you don't have to guess anymore. You've seen how Japanese people express different ideas in different contexts enough times that you know intuitively how to express certain ideas. Of course, that will take a long time, but that's just an example of minimizing the negative transfer. Okay, I believe that was all for this video. I guess a bit of a long video, but hopefully that was interesting. And thank you for listening. And if you're interested in language learning and talking about ideas, as I do, then you might be interested in subscribing to my channel. I post 1 or 2 videos a week about language learning topics. And if you have any suggestions for topics that I could cover, or if you have any questions about language learning or any specific languages, how to learn specific languages, leave me a comment down below and I will answer it in a video. Okay, thanks for listening, and see you in the next video.